Notre Dame had their spring game yesterday, and this quarterback battle at Notre Dame kind of been under the radar a little bit. I know right when the outset of spring happened, we were talking a lot about Tyler Buchner in the context of Buchner and J.J. McCarthy at Michigan and Ty Thompson, for instance, at Oregon. And how many, if any, of these true freshman quarterbacks, these early enrollee true freshman quarterbacks, were going to be able to come in and make some noise as it relates to the starting job? Well, at Notre Dame, I think to much less a national recognition, Jack Cohn came in. Now, Jack Cohn, who we used to call Jack Doan, who's a former pro wrestling referee, easy to see how you get those names mixed up. Cohn's got a little bit better arm talent than Doan did. But he, along with Drew Pine, they're involved obviously in this quarterback battle as well. And I was listening to Brian Kelly talk a little bit after the spring game yesterday. And it's very obvious to me, and this is kind of a trend, to be honest with you, with a lot of these young quarterbacks, which is no surprise, it's the norm. Tyler Buchner's not there yet. Now, I don't think they expected him to be there yet, but here's the good thing. They got an option, a proven option, a guy that used to play at Wisconsin, took him to a Big Ten title game, for example, in Jack Cohn, street name Jack Doan. And so they feel good about him. I'm using the word good intentionally because great would indicate they think they have national championship potential under Jack Cohn. I don't believe they think that right now. Now, the good thing about Brian Kelly is he doesn't mince words. He's brutally honest. Like, there is no veil. It's like the anti-Gus Malzahn approach. Malzahn would have about the same 5 or 6 pre-constructed sentences and phrases for every question you could ever ask him. Brian Kelly, it's like he's got a polygraph hooked up to his arm. He just gives it to you. And he's respectful in his answer, but he said, Tyler Buchner's done some good things, but he's a little ways away. He's a true freshman, so duh. And he didn't get to play high school ball last year. So Buchner, the irony here, if you watched the spring game, which, Colin, I think they had it on the Peacock app, the streaming app, which we don't own, so I'm not going to mention it again. But that was weird. So I didn't get to catch it, so I had to watch a very, very sketch-affily put-together replay, shall I say. Tyler Buchner led the only 2 touchdown drives. So this is one of those classic, did you watch just the spring game? Or did you check out the spring game and read your practice reports and listen to your whispers and intel on this program, for instance? Because Tyler Buchner's not the leader in the clubhouse for this job. The best intel out of Notre Dame that we've had, and it's been consistent, is this is Jack Cohn's job. They're not going to announce that. It certainly hasn't been announced. Nor should they, for obvious reasons, I think. But nothing changed Saturday, is my point, in the spring game for Notre Dame. So they're encouraged with his arm strength. Now, this is what I want to really zoom in on. You're going to get a lot of folks who are going to look at Jack Cohn, and I may be among them, just to be brutally honest with you, and they may look at him and they say, well, is this really an upgrade? Like, you're going from Ian Book, who, by the way, was drafted in the 4th round yesterday, 2 days ago at this point. So not a bad quarterback there by any stretch. Now, he set a lot of records at Notre Dame. Brian Kelly mentioned as much yesterday. Ian Book rewrote the record books here, and yet we're looking for an upgrade. And we're not going to be happy until we have an upgrade, and that's fine. And he's one of these dudes who embraces the pressure. He's fine with it, and he's fine with criticism of the program. But they, I think, know they have a little bit better arm talent at quarterback than I think the national perception is going to be. Whether that manifests itself into more gaudy passing statistics, we'll see. I mean, they made an effort to push it down the field at times yesterday, but it's a spring game, so I don't really know what that means necessarily. Tight end looks like a strength yet again this year for about the 47th year in a row. The wide receiver unit is good. Lawrence Keys is the guy that stood out to me. Like, that's a guy who flashed, because the thing about these good receiver rooms is you can have a good receiver room, and if you play some inferior competition, you can run up some numbers on them. But what you find is if you don't have any true alpha-type receivers, if they're all good, but the ceiling is good, then they can get shut down against really like future NFL-type defensive backs. Well, guys like Lawrence Keys, ideally we could clone him and have 2 or 3 more. Guys like him are the kind where if you got that piece in place, then everything else works off of that. Which makes their health vital, obviously. But number 2, the entire rest of the wide receiver unit can kind of work off that. So they've got names, like they got some guys. It's not a barren receiver room by any stretch. I would argue it's a strength of that team. But they got to have that hierarchy emerge. Offensive line is something Brian Kelly and his staff spent a lot of time on in spring. They're going to have to spend a lot of time on it leading into the fall. You ask people up there, and there are a couple of different iterations they would give you as to which starting 5 they're going to carry into Tallahassee. They open, by the way, against Florida State on the road. It's not a neutral site game. It's going to be Labor Day weekend, Sunday, standalone game, probably about 114 degrees. It's going to be great. So offensive line's a question there, but this feels like I would call it a New Year's Six caliber team. The kind of team that goes to the Cotton Bowl in a non-playoff year, something like that. A team that kind of hovers around that level with maybe the ceiling of, if the spark happens, if a critical mass of these pieces that we have question marks about, if they all gel, then that's a team that could back into the playoff. A team that could earn their way into the playoff. They got really good depth, defensive line, linebacker. I think they feel as good about the front seven as they have in quite a while. And the hope is, if you got questions on offensive line, for example, I don't think they have really questions at quarterback because you got an experienced guy there. But if you do have questions there, if you're trying to figure stuff out in the fall, hopefully you got a defense that will allow you some time, because we're showing the schedule right now. If you're listening on podcast, they open it at Florida State, and that is a game they should be favored in. I'm not going to call it easy by any stretch, but then they got a winnable one against Toledo, against Purdue, and then that Week 4 game against Wisconsin. I was trying to map out my own schedule for this fall. The thing about a Notre Dame schedule is you got to be very careful, as I get into the chat and block some people. As you look at a Notre Dame schedule, a lot of times you got to be careful because they play a lot of neutral site games. So that Week 4 game, you think, oh, that's a home game in South Bend. Well, it's actually down the road in Chicago, and they play that one at Soldier Field. So I don't know that I'm going to be at that one. I do know that game against North Carolina, day before Halloween, that's going to be really enticing. But Brian Kelly, again, brutal honesty from him all the time, expect nothing less. He talked at the outset of spring and then at the end of spring, and he'll talk about this all summer long, about how they don't worry about being good. They understand they can be good now. They've been good for several years. What he wants to be is he wants to win a national championship. We had him on the show last year. It was around this time last year. And I loved him so much because he was so honest about it. And he said, I know what the expectation is. I know we hadn't gotten it done, and we know what it takes. But here's where Brian Kelly is with Notre Dame, and then I'll move on. Every one of us has been there, whether you know it or not. I was there just last night, and where there is when you got the toothpaste tube and you have emptied out pretty much every ounce of toothpaste in that tube, and then you tell yourself, I'll go to the store tomorrow. But then you get home and you realize, you get to the sink at night, contacts are out, last thing you got to do, and you realize, I forgot to go to the store today. Can I get one more brush's worth of toothpaste out of that tube? Well, picture how hard it is to do that. Some of you break out scissors. I've just been a grind it on the edge until it works approach. But as hard as that is, that's what they're trying to do, because they try so hard. Like, they've developed good. They've sent kids to the draft, and they're there. In some cases, they've made the playoff. They're on the precipice. They played Alabama tough in the playoff, but yet you also realize the gap that still exists, and you wonder, we feel like we've squeezed every ounce of toothpaste we can out of here. How do we get it out? Well, the way you get it out is you got to be better at quarterback, and that's not an overnight process. But outside of that, and they do not have a dynamic first-round draft pick in all likelihood on this roster at quarterback this year. So how do you get it? Well, that's the rhetorical question. That's what they have to figure out.